Making restitution. Though leaders may not be responsible for the evil done by other leaders within their area of accountability, they should attempt to right the wrong. Here now is Gene Getz.
This principle right here really focuses on leadership responsibility. And it relates back to David. And it relates to an event that really didn't relate to him, but it was a sin that was committed that he had to deal with and take responsibility for. And there are times that there are things as a leader we need to take responsibility for, even though we're not first and foremost responsible for that event that led to sin or a violation of the will of God. That just goes with leadership. And we see that illustrated in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. During David's reign, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David inquired of the Lord. Now, the context for this is that this famine was a result of the sins that were committed, not by David, but by others in Israel and by Saul particularly, before David. The Lord answered, "It is because of the blood shed by Saul and his family when he killed the Gibeonites." Now you need to understand the context of the Gibeonites. These individuals, well, let's just go on to verses 2 and 3 because the text in itself explains a little bit of this. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but rather a remnant of the Amorites. And they lived, by the way, they lived in Canaan. The Israelites had taken an oath concerning them, but Saul had tried to kill them in his zeal for the Israelites and Judah. Now, let me just fill it in here just a little bit so we understand. What happened was the Gibeonites who lived in Canaan knew that there was a curse on the Canaanites, and they were a part of that. And so what they did is they knew that God said that they would not be under judgment if they were outside the land of Canaan. So they developed a scheme. And they had clothes that looked like they were worn out from a long travel. Their sandals were worn out from a long journey. And they had their wineskins that were broken and crusty. And they came to the Israelites and to Joshua and said, "Look, we're from a long distance, and we're coming to make peace and to make an oath with you." And so Joshua did make an oath with them that the Israelites would never, ever mistreat them. They took them as servants, but they would not mistreat them. Then, a short time afterwards, they found out it was a whole scheme. But the vow had been made, a vow that could not be broken. But Saul violated that vow. And so that brought the judgment of God on Israel, the famine. So David goes to the Lord and said, "Why?" And so the Lord explains it. So David summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them, realizing that they had violated this vow. He asked the Gibeonites, "What should I do for you? How can I make atonement so that you will bring a blessing on the Lord's inheritance?" In other words, we have violated the will of God. We have mistreated you. We've taken many lives. And how can we remove this curse, as it were, this judgment or this discipline from God because we mistreated you? The rest of the story is that they did ask for payment. And the payment was not money, but it was the lives of several of Saul's sons. And David followed through with that justice because of the violation of the will of God. And I think we need to realize, of course, that what happened there in the specifics does not apply to us under the new covenant, but it does illustrate a principle. And the principle that it illustrates is that David took responsibility for something he had not done as king. And he had to set the record straight. And so he went to them to make that right and to be in right relationship with God. And that's the price, really, of leadership, taking that kind of responsibility. I think when we look at the story of the New Testament, when we look at the fulfillment of why God chose Israel in the first place, we look at Jesus. And I think Jesus illustrates this principle more than we can ever imagine. in terms of taking responsibility for something he didn't do. And what was that? Our sins. He was without sin. And yet, he looked down from that cross and he said, Father, forgive them. Luke 23:34. Then Jesus said, Father, he's dying on the cross at this point for the sins of the world, and he's sinless. Father, forgive them because they do not know what they are doing. Jesus took the penalty, really, for our sins, the sins of the whole world. And they, of course, then divided his clothes and cast lots among themselves. Here's Jesus Christ, the Lord of the universe, taking responsibility for the sins of those Roman soldiers who nailed him there and for the whole world at that point in time. So the reflection and response question, why is it easy to deny the responsibility to correct another person's errors? Well, when we're innocent, when we didn't make the mistake, it's just logically to say, I'm not taking responsibility for something somebody else did. But when we're in certain leadership roles, we have that responsibility. It doesn't make sense, we say, for me to take responsibility for what you did. But let's remember that it wasn't logical either for Jesus to take upon himself the sins of the world. So he set that incredible example. This was Christ's love for us. To be honest with you, I've asked forgiveness for people in the church who failed. That doesn't mean they're not responsible. But I remember in one situation where we really dropped the ball. I didn't drop the ball. It was somebody else who had responsibility and really dropped the ball in relationship to an illness and following up and helping somebody, and it just shouldn't have happened. And I know the person who dropped the ball was just mortified that he had dropped the ball. And I said to this individual, I said, look, we've got to take responsibility, and I'm going to take responsibility with you. And I heard that this person was so offended and so hurt that they never wanted to see anyone in the church ever again. And believe me, this wasn't somebody that was just complaining. They had a reason to complain because it was such an error, such a mistake. And I knew that. And so I went with this man. I said, look, I'm going with you. And I knocked on that door. And by the way, when that man opened that door, he didn't want to talk to me or anybody. And it had to relate to a serious illness and death. And I just took responsibility and say, look, I'm the senior pastor of this church, and I want to ask your forgiveness. I really want to ask your forgiveness on behalf of those who dropped the ball. And I'm the senior pastor, and the buck stops here. And I'm taking responsibility for this. By the way, that really helped the other brother who dropped the ball. And he was humble about that as well. We turned that whole situation around because, believe me, as we stood there that day, it was humbling on our part, but it turned the whole situation around. There was forgiveness. And a relationship was built that lasted until that man died himself because he wanted me to be there when he died. Himself, the guy that I asked forgiveness on behalf of the church. So basically what I'm saying is that there are certain leadership roles where we take responsibility for our actions or the actions of others. And by the way, as a parent, there are times we have to take responsibility for things our children did and to say, I'm sorry for what my son did or my daughter did. But I'm accountable. I'm the father in this situation. I've seen that happen, by the way, where that's turned people around too. It's got to be sincere. It can't be manipulative. But I think that David really illustrates here this principle. This is another thing that God saw in his heart that was one of his strengths, that take responsibility. And so whether we are responsible or whether we're not responsible, the principle still applies, I think, particularly to those of us who are leaders, and if we're parents, we're leaders. Well, let me just state it again. Though leaders may not be responsible for the evil done by other leaders within their area of accountability, they should attempt to right the wrong. And in this case, it was very evil on the part of King Saul and what he did to the Gibeonites.